Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Pinching, editor of Pharma Times and your host for today. Welcome to our webinar on diversity in clinical trials, a more inclusive approach in patient recruitment. Make no mistake, we are on the precipice of great change. Over the past few years, the design of clinical trials has been rapidly evolving. However, the spectre of the international pandemic has further highlighted the need to maximize inclusivity and boost diversity. To achieve the full potential of drug development and accelerated access, clinical trials must be more targeted and involve patients from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different demographics, different ethnicities, and different profiles. Above all, patients must be stakeholders in this process, and that means igniting digital possibilities, incorporating convenience, demystifying participation, and delivering captivating data streams. With all these profound concepts in mind, I'll now introduce you to today's clinical trial luminaries. Kate Shaw, founder and CEO of Innovative Trials, will be discussing factors behind the lack of representation in clinical trials and patient recruitment. Next up is Sandra Amro, Pfizer's Global Clinical Trial Diversity Team Lead, who will discuss the consequences of the lack of diversity in patient recruitment for patients. Following Sandra, Jane Thurston, Senior Patient Recruitment Lead at Parexel, will elaborate on what the company is doing to promote inclusivity in patient recruitment. Thereafter, Sandra will return to share what Pfizer is doing to promote patient inclusivity. And Kate will conclude proceedings with what Innovative Trials is doing in this fast-moving arena. We will wrap up proceedings with some probing questions, which our panel will be poised to answer. Indeed, you will be able to input your questions throughout the webinar using the interface. Okay, let's get this show on the road. Kate, over to you.
Thank you, John. So first of all, I'd really like to kind of get everyone's input onto diversity. So what do we know about diversity? When do we think about diversity? What is the kind of one thing that comes to mind as to kind of the main reason for diversity? We've got a poll that we'll be running. If you'd like to kind of choose one answer, and we can then kind of understand kind of where we are as an audience. Elliot, can you launch the slides, please? Has everyone had a chance to vote? I'm not sure if the polling questions are working. And practical issues as well. So we ran an ankylosing spondylitis trial in the past, and it takes, from research, we understand that it takes the patients a long time to get active in the morning. If the visits are actually set at a time that's far too early for the patients, they're going to struggle to physically get there. On top of that, there's practical issues around kind of childcare and taking time off work. Even kind of the cost of traveling to a centre can be kind of a reason why patients don't participate. So it's a multifactorial challenge. And I think as part of us as researchers, we really want to kind of think about what we can do to help to kind of ensure that as many patients as possible can be participating in the trials. So again, what are the consequences? So, you know, we're really aiming for diverse patients in all the trials that we're working in. What are the consequences? And I think it really comes down to two main things: safety and accuracy. So for safety, again, we want patients in the trial that are representative of that disease. So if we have more patients that come from an African American background, that's kind of the prevalence that we want on those trials. So if we're not including everybody from diverse ethnicities, from ages, pregnancy status, then we're likely to find that once the drug actually is approved, then we might find that some adverse events are actually seen in patients that ultimately weren't included in the trials. It could also affect the dosing. So if we're finding that patients of a certain BMI either are included or not included, it could really affect actually how the dosing should be for patients of different sizes too. So a lot to consider. I'll now hand over and we'll actually kind of go through what Pfizer's doing. Sorry, Parexel. Sorry, Jane.
Oh, okay. I thought Pfizer was going, so I'll start. So at Parexel, we know that it takes a lot more than just words. It takes a genuine commitment and then action to ensure true diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. You have to be willing to actually take an honest look, ask tough questions at a corporate level, and develop a culture and climate that fosters true diversity, equity, and inclusion. I can't. For some reason, there we go. Okay, good. Once you have a solid infrastructure that models it in the people that you hire and the programs that you implement, only then can you really provide it in clinical trials to patients being ignored, disparaged, and excluded as a result of their color, ethnicity, social economic status, gender, sexual orientation, age, as well as those with physical and mental challenges. The impact of COVID, especially on people of color, was a wake-up call that more was required to make clinical trials accessible to everyone. So at Parexel, our patient insights department conducted an extensive global quantitative survey. They did interviews, facilitated focus group sessions, and held patient advisory council meetings that called on almost 2,000 people of color, comprised of patients, members of the public, and physicians, asking for their perspective on clinical trial diversity. Our aim was to gain a true understanding of the critical barriers to research access and to obtain guidance on how to successfully overcome them. The findings of this research identified key barriers to clinical trial inclusivity while offering very specific actions our industry can take to address these inequities in healthcare and clinical study access. One of the many key actions that were recommended to proactively engage with existing sites to support them in accessing a diverse accessing diversity of communities and selecting and partnering with new sites that actually work with patients from underrepresented backgrounds, because people want to be treated by people that look like them. Some specifics offered were having sponsors update their feasibility questionnaires to include asking potential sites about diversity in their patient populations and site staff. A comment made by one participant was that I think clinical trials, let me jump that, skipped ahead. Oh, no, okay. I don't know. I think that clinical trials, especially those within minorities and in certain areas, need to be accessible for those with limitations, both physically and financially. It may not always be an option to travel or for someone to have access to certain places. Many people forget that even in this day and age, not everyone has access to internet or public forms of transportation. And another comment made by a participant was, we have to meet patients where they actually are They may not be in a medical center. You may have to go to a community center, a religious organization, or local barbershops. If we train some community advocates, people who are in the community every day and who are trusted, you'd be surprised at the level of complexity of conversations that happen. Really illustrating that to make trials accessible to everyone, you must provide supports for communities of color. We also really need to broaden our thinking to go beyond just skin color and create access for those other underrepresented groups that include gender, age, and disability. So in 2018, Great Britain actually reached out to the LGBT community to determine how they viewed the medical community and their access to receiving treatment and participating in trials. And the results showed that over 60% experienced a lack of understanding of specific trans health needs, and nearly half experienced inappropriate curiosity from healthcare staff. And fully 1/3 of non-binary patients avoided treatment for fear of discrimination. So, again, in 2021, Parexel decided that it was important to put together a transgender patient advisory council to really help us listen and understand how we can better support clinical trial conduct and participation, obtain insights and feedbacks on positive and challenging interactions with healthcare professionals, gain guidance on best practices for optimal healthcare visits, explore themes of inclusivity and safety in clinical trial participation for transgender and non-binary patients. And what we found out is that they face a great deal of challenges and fear in getting access to healthcare. Many don't work and they don't even have health insurance. We also learned that people have very different goals when they're transitioning. One challenge that actually arises is there are no dosing standards around people in the process of transitioning. How do you dose them? Do you dose them as a male or a female? And then how much should you dose them? Some other key learnings were that questions to determine if a person has transitioned would be acceptable if appropriate context was provided around why the question is being asked and the rationale around safety is provided. For example, saying your medical history could really impact your safety. So it's important that we ask these questions. It would really help to make them feel that you're asking out of concern and that you're not just asking to be nosy. Therefore, it's really important that we equip staff with the language and training to support patients effectively and understand their very specific healthcare needs, and also to be sensitive to them as people and not something to be viewed as a curiosity is extremely vital. Interestingly, the most essential thing that transgender people want in order for them to feel comfortable in participating in a clinical trial is for us to provide them with gender neutral bathrooms. Another group of people with limited access to healthcare and clinical trials that are often forgotten are people with mental and physical disabilities, as reflected in these statistics. In honor of International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and in recognition of the importance of creating a further inclusive culture, Parexel launched a new committee recognizing the contributions of our disabled population, demonstrating our commitment to providing access to clinical research for all. So what are we doing with all this information that we've gleaned? Well, we know that real diversity and equity and inclusion begins with strategic development at the corporate level, ensuring that you keep the patients at the heart of all clinical trial activity. We created a DEI consultancy service to support sponsors in expanding and improving their DEI considerations, as well as developing study strategies around DEI and decentralized trial planning. Next, we know that it requires feasibility and study planning. You need to find patients first and then choose and open the site where they live. It's also important to have sites that reflect diversity and are located in racially and ethnically diverse communities. We also know that it takes site involvement. We need to help sites be more inclusive by helping them build their external referral network of diverse patients, by forging relationships with doctors of color in their own communities. For patient outreach, We create branded materials that will resonate with patients with respect to the message and images. It requires thinking about each community and the diversity of that community with regards to developing and translating educational materials in multiple languages so potential participants can read trial information in their preferred language that they can understand. And then execution is the final step. We find that many times sites don't have the resources or the bandwidth to do any community or physician outreach. So to provide diversity support service, we've been using clinical enrollment managers who are seasoned and knowledgeable to be boots on the ground for sites. This has truly been a huge game changer in reaching patients of color and having them enroll in clinical trials, because CEMs are dedicated to building relationships with trusted community thought leaders, calling on small business owners of color, barbershops, churches, nail and hair salons to educate on clinical trials as a treatment option. It also requires providing ongoing patient care support. Currently, we're actually at Parexel working with Innovative Trials to offer patient navigators. And their function, it will be to support and be that someone that the patient or caregiver can call and speak with in their own language regarding any questions that they have about the study or to make travel or transportation arrangements, to really make sure that we're leaving any language as a barrier to participation. And we're also supporting sites by providing cultural competency training for investigators and site staff so that they are more aware and responsive to the needs of specific patient populations. So we have established relationships with our Site Alliance sites, and by having these strong and long relationships, we're able to explain our needs and our expectations regarding recruiting diverse populations. At the same time, we help them to be successful because we know that we need to provide them with the tools, the resources, and the collaterals that are necessary for them to be successful. We're also investing in and supporting new investigators of color by providing a series of workshops through Parexel Academy to help them in their new role. And to further invest in these new investigators of color, we're also asking our Site Alliance investigators to actually mentor them so that we can increase the number of sites that serve these patient populations. In my role as a senior patient recruitment strategist, it's my job to look at the barriers that can prevent successful patient recruitment and then to deploy strategies to overcome them. Transportation to and from sites can be a challenge and a financial hardship for many people, which ultimately prevents them from enrolling or enrolling only then to drop out. So instead of always talking about reimbursing, I believe that some patients of lower socioeconomic status should be provided preloaded debit cards so they don't have to make a decision between being able to pay their gas bill or going to their site visit. Childcare is another barrier for people with young children at home. So we're recommending that daycare be provided or paid for to create access, along with even meal cards when long visits are required. And we've also been looking at how to offer flexible decentralized trials based on the wants and needs of patients. It's required us to look at providing cell phones, Wi-Fi, data plans, because we know that not everyone has internet or computers in their homes. To make trials decentralized, we must provide patients with tools and resources they need so that they're able to participate and then be able to stay compliant in the trial. Again, it truly is all about meeting the patients where they are. It's realizing that not one size fits all, that people's culture, ethnicity, race, gender, age, and disabilities come into play in each and every study. And it's truly our job to think of everything that we can do to make clinical trials accessible to everyone. So this requires commitment from all of us, and it will take time. It requires us continuing to talk, to ask each other questions, learn from one another, and to help one another so that we can make clinical research accessible for not just some, but for everyone. In conclusion, I ask all of you today to really go back and see what your company is doing to make clinical research available to everyone, everywhere. and see if there is opportunity to do more to improve engagement with sites and patients from all underrepresented communities. Well, thank you so much for your time and attention. And now I'll turn it over to Sandra.
Thank you so much. My name is Sandra Amaro, and I'm going to cover a lot of what Pfizer is focused on in this space. And as I'm listening to the presentation so far, I think there's a common theme in all that we're trying to drive forward together. And I think the call to action is to continue that conversation, right? And for us to continue working together as partners. But I'll start with my first slide is Pfizer's commitment to this work. And I'm super proud that this commitment is coming from our CEO of the company and our Chief Development Officer. So this is coming from our senior most leaders is our commitment. And this commitment has been made externally and internally. And every Pfizer employee is accountable for this commitment to inclusion and equity. And so we are committed to achieving racially and ethnically diverse participation that is either in alignment with the disease prevalence, so whatever disease we're trying to tackle by way of a clinical trial, or the natural population. So we take into consideration the natural population in the United States, specifically for our preventative vaccine trials, and really taking into consideration all of the individuals that could potentially benefit from our medicine or our vaccines, and wanting to make sure that we have the right distribution and the right representation in our clinical trials. Equity in clinical research and why it's important. I think most of us understand this, but I think for us at Pfizer, we had to first define what we mean by diversity, because there's many components of diversity. And so what we're focused on right now at Pfizer is very US centric. However, we are slowly moving into transitioning to how do we cover this outside of the US? What does diversity actually mean outside of the US? But we think of race, ethnicity, age, and sex. And we recognize that in order for us to make better medicine that is fit for all, we need to recruit those that ultimately could benefit from those medicines once they're available. And I think COVID-19 was a great example of, the fact that no one was essentially protected from COVID-19. However, our communities of color carried the highest burden when it came to COVID, and still do, right? So we need to make sure that there is representation in all the clinical trials. And for us at Pfizer, we are all accountable for this work, and every clinical trial that we conduct, regardless of phase or therapeutic area, we define recruitment goals at the diversity level that we are looking to achieve. And that is based off of the disease prevalence. So we're using real world data, medical literature, and then also balancing that with US census data. So we know that it's important for us to carry forward the learnings that we have gleaned from our COVID-19 trials. And we're still piecing all of that together. As you can imagine, we had to move very swiftly to get in front of the pandemic. And so we're still pulling together, what are our lessons learned? What can we take away from COVID and how we operated, and how do we apply that going forward so that we can be more effective, and we can reach the individual populations that we've struggled with reaching previously. And so we have 4 commitments that are sharing on this slide, which is the first one is essentially ensuring that we have the right racial and ethnic distribution in our studies that reflect the countries we're recruiting patients in, and also in alignment with that disease epidemiology. We're looking to expand access and awareness to clinical trials to improve the experience of our participants, and then sharing knowledge more broadly so that we are transparent in what we're doing, because this is not something, clinical trial diversity is not something that one organization, one sponsor can correct solely on their own. So we have to learn from each other and continue to be transparent in our conversations. And then fully embracing digital tools for speed and quality, and also finding ways to remove those barriers to entry, and really looking at decentralized clinical trials as a mean to bring clinical research to the people and meet people where they're at. So last year, we actually produced, as part of our commitment to this work, we needed to really understand where we have historically been. So what was our baseline? We knew that we were not recruiting to the right levels within racial and ethnic groups, right? You can see that when you look at the FDA drug trial snapshots. As an industry, we have not done well in this space. COVID-19 put a spotlight on this, but we weren't doing this well years before COVID. So as part of our commitment, we produced a publication, and we did a deep dive analysis of our demographic data in the US. And it was from almost a 10-year time span. So it was from 2011 to 2020. The analysis covered 213 clinical trials. Again, all of that was recruitment in the US for this first publication. And it encompassed over 103,000 participants. And what we were looking for was overall demographics of race, ethnicity, sex, and age, and the percent of trials that achieved that racially and ethnic distribution at levels that were at or above the US Census. So we used that as our metric for this publication. And within the publication, we then broke it down further across our therapeutic areas. And so you can see them here: oncology, I&I, rare disease, vaccines, internal medicine. And then we also had a component of neuroscience, which was a legacy therapeutic area for us. The publication is available. It's publicly available. It's everything behind the scenes of what our data was telling us for the last, from that time frame from 2011 to 2020. And we're using that as our accountability marker, right? So we will continue to do these types of publications to see how we have improved year to year from where we were over this time span. So I encourage you to go and take a peek at that publication. It was released back in July of last year. My last slide is really focused on the 5 areas of focus that we are continued to stay focused to at Pfizer. And to my co-presenters' previous comments, this is definitely the long game. So this is not something that we are committed to because of COVID or due to COVID. These are commitments we made well before COVID. However, we have accelerated them because of what we saw with COVID. And so the first one was embedding the importance of equity and inclusion in our organization. So we needed to do some, I call it, we needed to clean our house. We needed to get our house in order so that all of our colleagues at Pfizer understood our commitment to this work. And within everyone's role, what did it mean? So what does this mean for someone that's actually writing the clinical protocol, or someone that's, making site visits and interacting with our investigator sites? So we needed to really embed this and really shift the culture and the conversation internally. We rolled out a training that was released to all of our colleagues at Pfizer that really talked about why this is important, why equity and inclusion is critical to science, what it means for you as Pfizer employees, and then also the history. So how did we get here, right? What is the history? Why are the barriers that exist today? How do we get here? So we talked a lot about the history of Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and forced sterilizations, so that people could really understand when we talk about trust issues in communities of color, where that mistrust has come from. It's important to know where people are at so you can meet them where they're at. We continue, so we've done a lot of work over the last 2 years with this embedding of diversity, but this is a continued commitment. So we can't stop talking about it. We can't stop revisiting certain trainings and making sure that we're enhancing. As we learn more, we need to make sure we continue to share. The other piece is evolving site partnerships and really using a more data-driven approach for how we select clinical sites for our studies. We need to identify potential sites that are in the greatest catchment area for where underserved populations live. So if we're not placing investigator sites in communities of color with investigators of color, we are doing a disservice. We're doing a disservice to the people that we're looking to serve. So we're really focused on growing more diverse sites with diverse investigators, and not just the investigator, it's the study coordinators, all of those individuals that are at the clinic that will be interacting with those patients need to look and speak like those that they're looking to treat. And so we're really focused on building those partnerships with sites. And we actually, earlier this month, just rolled out an awareness training for our sites. And that just was released a couple weeks ago, which is an awareness training from a site perspective. This is a joint commitment. This isn't just a commitment Pfizer's making. It's a commitment that we're asking all of our partners to maintain and keep with us. And so we rolled out this training so that our sites know what our commitment is. And if you're working on a Pfizer study, what we're asking your commitment to be. We also included some video vignettes in this training with a clinician of color that does clinical research. We wanted her to share her voice with her peers on what she has to really what she has to do when she's engaging with patients. So we talk about implicit bias, cultural bias, and how that actually plays a role, even with clinicians of color. And so we wanted her to share her voice so that this was a peer-to-peer conversation. And so we just rolled that out to our investigator sites. Building trust and awareness in communities and community engagement is a place that we need to stay committed to for the long haul. This is not something that we can say we've done. It's not a check the box exercise. And honestly, it needs to be done above clinical study, right? So if we're trying to build awareness and trust, it's at the clinical trial experience level. As a sponsor, we can't just roll into a community of color or an underrepresented community when we have a clinical trial that we're looking to recruit participants in, right? That's very self-serving. The optics of that are horrible. And so we are looking for ways to build into these communities and partner with trusted voices. So those nonprofit advocacy organizations that are the trusted people, they're the trusted voices. How do we arm them with information, and how do we support them so that they can do what they do best and really help share messaging? Addressing the practical barriers to entry. So really understanding what those barriers are, and not just for the participants. We often talk about what the barriers are for the participants. However, there are also barriers that exist for sponsors like Pfizer, and there are barriers that we actually almost put in our own way. So what we've also done is looked at the barriers that we can remove for us internally at Pfizer so that we can actually do a better job at reaching underserved patients. And then sharing our knowledge, right? So the publication was a big first step in really just having a peek behind the curtain and what we've done historically, which again, isn't great. It's not where we need to be. We know this, but that's where we grow from. So the publication was the first way to share knowledge. I think webinars like this is the other way to share knowledge. We need to stay committed to the conversation, but we need to start moving from conversation into action, right? So we need to find ways that we can partner together because again, one company, one CRO, one sponsor won't correct all of these things that we need to do together. So my call to action is that we continue to partner together. We lock arms and we do what's right for the communities that have been historically underserved for years. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to hand it back to Kate at this point, who's going to cover her part of the presentation.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with my previous presenters. I think we're all got the same message, really. I think between us all, we can all kind of make progress. And one thing I'd like to say really is it's small steps. It's every trial we work on, let's try and do something for diversity. We know we can't fix everything in one study, so let's kind of try slowly to see what we can achieve together. So for us as a company, we're kind of looking at diversity kind of across all what we do, really. So again, we have enrollment managers who actually go out to site, go out to communities. Through some studies we're working on, actually we're working with communities, actually exactly, you know, what's been said previously, actually take the trial outside of the centre, talk to people in their community where they feel much more comfortable, and kind of give them the opportunity to ask the questions that they might have. Study materials is really important, and we want to provide education materials to all our patients in their native language, and really so that they understand exactly what they'll be doing in the clinical trial, and then they can make their own informed decision. Digital advertising actually is showing to be really helpful in kind of opening trials up to diverse populations. There was a study recently actually which is for a diverse trial, and they found that actually through the advertising, they're opening the trial further. So again, we're pushing the trial further out of the site into diverse communities. And this has really opened up the kind of clinical trials to different populations, really for kind of reasons we've said already, that maybe especially on decentralized trials, they're not having to visit the centre, that maybe then financial reasons is not a challenge for them to kind of enroll in the study. So digital advertising is definitely kind of opening up trials on diversity. And then again, working at diversity workshops of sites. So again, really considering when the trial is placed at the site, how they're going to recruit the diverse population. So just wanted to give you kind of a couple of case studies, really. So we worked on a study for HS. HS actually is quite a rare disease, and it's characterised by multiple abscesses of the skin that form in and around oil and sweat glands and hair follicles, and it mainly kind of shows kind of under the armpits and groin areas. We were on this study, we were able to really offer, we understand, we know for this population that actually most of the trials conducted in HS are actually in Caucasians, but the incidence is so much higher in the African American and Asian population. So again, we're doing a disservice to the patients who have this disease by not ensuring they're enrolled in the study. So we needed to actually ensure that the study was representative for the population. So what did we do? We did a multitude of different kind of strategies to really kind of broaden out the study and take it to the patients rather than expecting them to come to us. So next slide. So we really did a comprehensive outreach for this study, and I know this is not accessible for every single study, but just to kind of give you some hints and tips as what else potentially you could do. So HCP referral, we actually went out to talk to referral doctors in different populations to see whether they could refer patients in. So again, talking to investigators of colour, different diversity really to broaden out rather than totally relying on our principal investigators site to recruit the patients. We worked with pharmacists. Again, patients might not be diagnosed with the condition, but they might be seeking treatment. So pharmacists is a good option as well to maybe present patient education materials with pharmacists, leave the information there so that the patient can pick up and potentially then participate after receiving information. Online communities, again, online is actually, you know, some patients it's quite a private disease. Maybe some patients are a little bit, you know, embarrassed or concerned about having the disease and not want to share that. So online communities is a good option where we can again talk about the trials with approvals to make sure that again we're opening up the opportunity for different patients. Patient groups there's a multitude of patient groups in different conditions, and we found this for HS too, that obviously patient advocacy groups are wanting to do things for their patients. So again, if us as communities can actually inform patient groups about the trials that are happening in their disease area, they can be educated on the trials and potentially share that with their own community. We find that some of the patient groups in the US would need to be paid for that service. It's, you know, they're a charity. They would like to be paid for the service. We find that some of the patient groups in Europe actually make the decision themselves whether they wish to kind of let their members know. But patient groups are a really good option, again, of pushing the trial kind of out into the wider community. So what did we see? Did we see any difference by actually, really taking the trial outside? And the result is yes. I mean, by the end of the study, we found that 61% of patients screened were actually from a diverse background. So we were able to meet the requirements of the study, and we were able to open it up to the patients who actually have the disease, which tends to be, like I said, more African Americans and Asian population rather than the Caucasians that are normally studied. So it definitely helps. This is one study. It's different studies are different, but it really showed what a difference it could make from actually really thinking from the beginning, how do we make sure our study is representative of the disease that we're trying to study. I mentioned earlier about study materials. So this was a different study. This was for NASH. And so we created materials that, again, were representative of that population. As I said earlier, you want to see yourself in the advertisements or working with the investigators. You want to see people that look like you and, ultimately represent that population. So fatty liver disease tends to be people slightly older, from, with a higher BMI, but different sexes and different nationalities. And so the materials were created to represent everybody who could potentially have NASH. NASH is a disease that people don't even know they have. And so we wanted people to come forward who thought, well, maybe, that looks like me. Potentially I might have that disease, and I want to see if I have it so I can have treatment. So patient education materials are so important. And again, really important that these are translated. They need to be translated, obviously, and approved through ethics committees or IRBs. But again, we want to make sure that we're opening this up to everybody, so that language is not a barrier. Language is an opportunity for patients to participate. So I just wanted to kind of, again, kind of the same messages as everyone else. Let's all take this as a community of clinical research. How can we push diversity forward? And every single study we're working on, every little step makes such a big difference. And I think then we'll actually start to see momentum and actually seeing ourselves opening up trials for everyone to participate. So as presenters, we've taken up a lot of your time, and we'd like to open this up to Q&A and answer some of your questions.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that, Kate, and thank you to all our panelists for some absolutely fascinating insights. And just to let you all know, the entire webinar will be available on Bright Talk afterwards and on the PM Live website, as will the slide decks as well. Okay, let's start with a question. Will the implementation of diversity initiatives in clinical trials increase the overall costs and complexities of those projects? Who's going to start?
I can make a start, and I'm sure that my colleagues will want to add into that. I think the answer is potentially yes. Complexity, I think potentially it could add to cost and also time, actually. And so that's why I'm kind of encouraging people to do small steps. I think to go from kind of not considering diversity to 100% considering diversity is going to take time and money. And so I'd recommend everyone to take small steps. I think if people are at a site level as well, maybe that's something that they can speak to their sponsors about, to see if there's actually finance available to help with improving diversity on the studies.
I think I would just add that while it will add cost, the thing that you have to think about is the money that goes into, again, all the research to develop these drugs and then bring them to market. And if you're bringing drugs to market that truly aren't efficacious for the people that most are impacted by them, what have you accomplished? And I think that's what we see, is that if you want to have drugs that are more efficacious for people impacted by lupus, who are not traditionally Caucasian people, but people of color, or, sickle cell anemia, then you have to have those people predominantly in clinical trials, not people that look like me. So I think that there has to be a commitment, but I think you have to look at, from the very beginning, it only makes sense if you're going to invest in clinical research and the marketing and everything.
And I'll just add, I think there's a level of investment that needs to happen right? So in the level of investment into the communities, I'll go back to my soapbox, right? Is we need to make investments that are not at the study level, right? We need to make investments into education, awareness, community building. Because if you do that, we all actually do a little bit of that. When you actually have a clinical trial that you are then recruiting for, you've set the stage, right? You've kind of put all of those materials already in the field, right? So I think there is an investment. I think we all need to make an investment. There is a financial commitment here. I think at a study level, we need to be mindful of patient recruitment budgets, right? And making sure that patient recruitment budgets can support all of the things that we need to do from a recruitment standpoint that is also inclusive of diverse recruitment, right? And what those strategies may be. And I think for us we often struggle sometimes with speed and diversity, right? And there's this assumption that it's going to take longer to recruit those that we haven't been able to reach. And it only takes longer that first time, right? So if we start to do this slowly, over time, it's just, we've built the framework and we've built the connections. So I think we just have to start. And it's the long game, but it's also those very incremental steps to get us there.
Excellent, and much to ponder on that subject. This is quite a simple question, but I think one with a lot of hidden complexity, and it's about, amid all the noise around clinical trials, do you think enough is done to impress upon the patients how important their role is?
I'll just say that I don't, and that's one of the things that I think, especially in bringing people of color into trials, is to really create that awareness through education. I always say you can't walk through a door if you don't know it's there or why you should walk through it. And so I think that it's about them understanding the importance of them actually participating in trials, because it will help sponsors like Pfizer to develop more efficacious drugs, and to really help, with the effects of their diseases that most impact people of color. So absolutely. I just think it starts with education and having them understand why it's important, why they're needed to come to the table.
Yeah. And I also think we can all do a better job. I think the why is extremely important. Like, why is it important for us all to consider clinical research as an option? But then I think it's also important for us to be really transparent with those participants and those patients that do participate after the study, to say what you did translated into this, right? So I think we need to make sure that the conversation with our patients becomes more full circle, so that they understand the why, but then what did my participation actually mean? What did it mean for the bigger picture? And so I think we all can do a better job of that with transparency for our patients.
I agree. I think, patient retention really starts the first time you talk to the patient. And so, ideally we want the patient to go away actually having a good experience in the trial, that they've understood the trial, they've made an informed decision, and they felt appreciated the whole way through. So I think it's a whole study job really to make sure the patient does feel appreciated. So that's from the site staff. That's also, for sponsors, companies like Parexel, ourselves, that should provide an education materials to show, and retention materials too. So again, to ensure that they have the information and need the information that they need to kind of continue participating. Pfizer's doing a good job on gratuity cards and actually saying thank you to patients, to make sure that they realise how important they are. But absolutely, we could all do more, and I think it's an ongoing job to actually ensure that patients are feeling valued. Patients, the take up of a second trial for patients is still really low, which, again, the more that we can ensure that patients feel appreciated, the more likely to participate in a second trial too. So let's start retention at recruitment. And again, let's make sure the patients really understand they're so key to this to make it successful.
Absolutely. Next question. In your experience, have you included Indigenous populations in clinical trials? And further to that, could it be considered a vulnerable population?
So maybe I'll go first from a Pfizer perspective. That's definitely a population that we would consider underserved and undermet in clinical research. And so we are working to try to find ways to build relationships with those, with those underserved populations to see how do we get them included? How do we meet them where they're at? And some of them, I think for us, when we look at the data set for real world data, a lot of times the population is not reflected even in the data set because of how they receive treatment, right? Where they receive care, potentially with Indian services. And so we're working to try to find ways to build relationships there. And see how we can better serve them, and that is gonna take some time to build those relationships, for sure. But I would definitely consider them an underserved and unmet population.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're absolutely an underserved populations, and it's back to taking the trial outside of the site, and so talking to patients and community groups in their community. So having people explain what the trial is and ultimately how it could potentially benefit their population. So as we all know, there's some populations that are kind of have a high incidence of a certain disease, and so I'm kind of thinking of the BRCA gene for for breast cancer and ovarian cancer, and it's kind of the incidences are much higher in an element of the Jewish population. And so again, our job is to actually go out and educate to that population as to why the fact that BRCA incidence is much higher in their population, and what they can do to be aware of this, and just I think our job is to educate everybody in an environment that they feel comfortable with, and that people are then more likely to ask questions and take the information in. So we should take these trials outside of the sites as much as we possibly can to then ultimately have patients feel confident to come into the sites to participate.
I just want to add that it's something very important to me because my children actually are a quarter Native American Indian. Their grandfather was actually born on an Indian reservation, and I've seen that there is such a history of mistrust that they have for white people, that we really have to start in building those relationships. I mean, really building those relationships, because for so many years they have been forgotten, and we haven't done anything to really embrace them or reach out and try to include them. And so when we go out and say, oh, well, we want you to be part of a trial now. Oh, great. You just want to use me as a guinea pig, which is one of the comments that were actually made. So I think, it just, especially in that particular population, we have a whole lot of work to do. But I think, it's education, but even before education, it is about truly building trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to let everybody know, we've got dozens of questions, and we will be striving to answer all of them after the webinar is finished, because we've probably only got time for one or two questions more. But rest assured, the panel won't be able to leave until they've written down some answers. So probably the final question is, and it may be one without an answer, but it's certainly one for discussion. Does diversity in clinical trials interfere with the randomization process?
I would say no.
I would say no as well.
Me too. Absolutely. no, it's important that the patients actually, screened for the study and talked about the study, but no, it doesn't
Right. Randomization is based on the inclusion and exclusion of the protocol. So whether someone is, of a different race or color would not impede that randomization. It's what's the specifics of what they have and the biomarkers or that determine that.
I would say inclusion exclusion criteria is the governing component for diversity. I think if you start getting into stratification at the point of randomization for different subpopulations, you could potentially see an impact. But I don't know that sponsors are actually stratifying for diversity to ensure balance of treatment across populations. I think we're just at the study level really looking for that full distribution, not at the treatment level.
Okay, well, I think we're all in agreement that diversity in clinical trials is a positive thing. And I think we can squeeze in one more question. Do you think offering a more patient-centric, decentralized clinical trial would improve diverse recruitment?
Well, I think, based on, part of what I just talked about, I think it can. But I think that you also can't just assume that, home nursing is going to be something that would be welcome by everybody because it makes it more convenient. Because one of the things that we've learned is in some cultures, if people know that you're sick, it has an impact on the way you're treated. So are they going to want, home nurses coming up to their door that all their neighbors can see? Absolutely not. I think we also have learned that some patients are embarrassed by their homes. So I think, we have to look at then taking it outside of the homes. Maybe it's meeting at a hotel or so. But I just think, you just have to really look at who is going to be, a part of this trial, who's going to be impacted. And as I said earlier, it's really looking at what the patient needs and what the patient wants. And maybe, a patient doesn't want that. So you can't force it on them, and trying to be more flexible. And I think if we're able to be flexible in diversifying those things into centralized trials, absolutely. I think we can have a great deal of diversity, and I think that we really can broaden and open up the scope far wider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I think there's different modalities that we can offer through decentralized clinical trials, and we're looking at those now at Pfizer. One thing that I've challenged the team with is, as we think of decentralized clinical trials as a way to remove certain barriers, let's be mindful of any barriers that we actually introduce with some of these changes, right? So let's not go in blind that we may actually introduce some unintended consequences. So we have to kind of with eyes wide open as well, because what we don't want to do is remove one barrier just to add two more, right?
Exactly.
I agree. I think it's another option in our toolkit, isn't it? For some trials it's a really good option, and some trials it isn't. And I think it's again kind of thinking about the patients at the beginning of the study. Does this make sense? Yes, no, or can we do a hybrid model as well? And so I think it's great that we now have another option to consider, and ultimately, make this decision on behalf of the patient. So to me, it's a positive, but not for every single trial and not for every single patient either. So it's another tool in our toolkit to work with.
Indeed, it is, Kate. And I think that is a wrap for today. And thank you to everybody for attending. And in particular, thanks to Kate, thank you to Jane, and thank you to Sandra for some really quite captivating speeches and contributions. And I think today we've really seen a glimpse of the future and how things could change, and all for the better. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and I hope to see you soon. And remember, the whole webinar is available on various platforms, PM Live website and Bright Talk. But for now, it is goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.